Hi, folks. Can you believe another Tuesday evening? How are we? I'm going to put the pre-show on just for a moment as we count down to 8 p.m. Nice to see everybody in the chat and some very good conversations about money printing and a few other things going on there as well. And nice to see some new names as well as some of the old familiars. Of course, the dogs are here. Well, when I say the dogs, I've got a dog. The other dog's just snuck around the corner again. Meteor seems to want to sort of sit out of her bed at the minute. But anyway, the dogs are here. Hopefully they'll be relatively quiet. And of course, as I show the studio, you can see there Robbie teed up, ready to come in a moment. And the rest of the studio is also working as well as expected with the chat and with the multi-view. So I think everything is functioning as it should. Hopefully, fingers crossed. As with these things, there's always a little bit of, well, it looks like it's okay, but we'll see. Anyway, a lot to talk about tonight, of course, with Robbie. And we're going to focus in on the whole question of the banking system and how that actually links into the politics and a few other things as well. So very important conversation. Anyway, we've hit 8 o'clock, so I'm going to take the pre-show off. And then I'm going to start the show formally. I'll be back in just a moment. Well, hello, and nice to see you here. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on the live stream tonight on this Tuesday evening, the 26th of August, 2025. Hope you're well, and thank you very much for taking some of the time out to spend it with us. It's really appreciated. And of course, today I have Robbie with me, and we're going to go into some very interesting conversations, particularly about some of the banking issues that are going on at the moment, and how that interfaces with politics and how we're not getting the good outcomes that we should be getting and what we can do about it. Just before I bring him in, I will remind you, as I normally do, that we're not providing specific financial or legal advice. It's a general conversation. We moderate the chat, but feel free to throw your questions, comments, and suggestions in as we go. We do moderate, but unless there's something really, really bad, we let it all through. As at the 26th of August, as I said here, and the link to get my attention is at Walk the World. So if you put that in your conversation point, it'll get into my queue and I'll see it if you have a question for Robbie or myself. I've also enabled Super Chat, which means if you want to get your question top of the list, you can do that. Or indeed make an introduction to what we do around here. Greatly appreciated those who support us through the various channels, be it Patreon or other mechanisms too. And the Super Chat, of course, is part of that process. We don't do this for profit. We do this because this is a really important conversation to be had, and it really helps us. So appreciate all those who support us. Anyway, let's get Robbie straight in because there's so much to talk about. Hey, Robbie, great to see you back again. How are you doing?
I'm good, Martin. And can I say before we begin, I'm not going to let your audience goad me into losing my temper today.
Okay. Well, we'll see how the bingo.
That's the plan anyway. That's the plan anyway.
We'll see how the bingo call goes because I reckon that there'll be a few issues that we'll touch on this evening, which may well raise.
It's an infuriating subject.
It is. And look, I thought it was really important to have this conversation, Robbie, because there's a lot that we can point to in terms of things not working really well for ordinary Australians. And, I don't know where you want to look at this, but, just to give you a couple of inputs, of course, my mortgage stress is still very high. The rental stress is really high. Mortgage stress has come down slightly. We've got the data from Roy Morgan showing that mortgage stress overall is down a bit, although they calculate it very differently to the way I do. But more importantly, when they actually dive into some of the analytics, they showed that those on lower incomes are really up against it still relative to others, whereas others that are actually doing a little bit better from an income perspective are not surprisingly doing a little better. And they actually looked at it through their various cohorts, and basically they're saying that the bottom cohorts are really stuffed. And when you actually think about it, it's maybe not too surprising insofar that the debt pressure on households is building quite dramatically, and all the data shows that the lending is continuing to grow. This is actually the information from the ABS. They only report it now quarterly rather than monthly, which I think is a bit suspect. But basically, you can see there that the overall loan growth is still rising. Investor growth is rising faster. And of course, CBA came out with their very strong profit announcement, very strong valuations. Although their profit was up, their share price dropped quite substantially. But the point here is they're talking about the home loan book expanding by 6%. 6%. So loan growth continuing to go faster than the inflation or income growth. So more people are being effectively barbecued by loans. And of course, the data that we come back to, median home prices versus capacity to pay, is all over the shop. So for ordinary people, Robbie, banking is not working for them. And that's before we get into the bank closure conversation point. And the question I've got to come back to, and why I come back to you, is why are we in this pickle, right? We had an inquiry on bank closures. We had an inquiry on whether ASIC was protecting investors. Those inquiries are parked in the Senate, so not much has happened. And so it seems to me that we can raise issues, but for some reason, our politicians seem to be, trapped. And that sort of caused me then to sort of pose the question, which is what this slide was about, right?
Yep,
Are the banksters calling the shots? Are they actually pulling all of the strings? And, they're getting fat on the profits. But what about everybody else? And that's really what I wanted to spend a bit of time talking with you about tonight.
Well, the short answer is yes, the banksters are calling the shots, and we can go home. It's a good conversation, Martin. Now, let's talk about what the property situation, right? Because this week, the Albanese government has announced the bringing forward the 5% deposit scheme. Mm. I was watching these politicians in Parliament, Labor politicians, crow about this yesterday in Parliament, because they're talking about how many young people will be able to get into homes. But the homes they're talking about are debt traps, right? And at this stage of the game, 2025, it is unforgivable. There is no excuse for politicians not to know when their policies will make the core problem worse, not better. So yes, they will get young people into homes, the young people who are just so desperate to get into a mortgage and get a home, get on the ladder, and they only have to pay the 5%. But there's no doubt that part of the government's calculation and the buyer's calculation, certainly the real estate agent's calculation, and absolutely the bank's calculation, is that a policy like this will drive up prices, and therefore that 5% will quickly become a much bigger equity because of capital gain quickly, right? Because of this property. And therefore they're making the core problem fundamentally worse. And they know that. And this has been the story of the last 25 years. And the big one, I think we discussed this in a bit of detail earlier this year because of the Shane Wright article that came out in on 1st of January from the national, the cabinet doc papers that got released from 20 years earlier. And those cabinet papers that revealed that in 2004, the Productivity Commission wrote a report for the federal government, John Howard and Peter Costello, and said that capital gains tax discount you introduced in 1999 has had a consequence. And the consequence is that the housing market is no longer connected to affordability. It has incentivized such a great increase in investors, and you showed the investors on that chart there, and the investors are rising again faster than home buyers. It's shown such a rapid increase, permanent increase in the number of investors in the market that has bid up house prices so that they're not affordable. That has forced out prospective first home buyers. So now they're renters. And so that's made the rental market bigger, and that's bid up those prices as well. And this happened so quickly, there's no way the housing market could have kept up with it. And I made a controversial post on the weekend on Twitter about this and caused a bit of a meltdown, because I made this point because I wanted to make a point that this happened. The Productivity Commission report to the Howard government was before high immigration. High immigration had not started in Australia in 2004 when this happened. And my controversial first line of my tweet was, immigration is not the cause of Australia's housing crisis. Now, I made the point, of course, when you look at the maths today, immigration is certainly making it worse. That's not an issue. But you take immigration away and we still have this fundamentally broken housing system because of government policy that started, and we've gone through this before, the root cause 98 when they took land out of the CPI, and that was the Reserve Bank and the Howard government. That meant that as real estate went up, it didn't register as inflation. That meant the Reserve Bank could keep dropping interest rates and keep fueling it. That was a fateful decision. Capital gains tax. My understanding about the capital gains tax decision, by the way, the 50% discount, it had nothing to do. Castelli wasn't even thinking about the market. He was thinking about the stock market. Yeah. But it had this perverse outcome in the housing market, and it just went bananas with this massive influx of investors. The first home buyers grant was introduced. The first one was introduced in 2001. And I can talk about these things because I was there. I mean, you were there too, of course, and probably most of the viewers here were there. But this is the sort of stuff our party focused on, what these policy decisions were. We paid a lot of attention to them, right? And I remember here in Melbourne, by 2000, the way property price just went crazy from 2000 to 2004. And I think, I don't know if even the COVID jump actually was as fast as the increase from 2000 to 2004. It was such a massive increase in house prices. And this is anecdotal, I know, but it's anecdotal because I lived in Melbourne. I'd never seen so much construction in my life. Yet I was being told it's because there wasn't enough supply of housing. That was and the Productivity Commission belled the cat. It wasn't lack of supply of housing. It was what they had permanently done to the market with this massive influx of investors. Now, where did the investors get their money from, Martin? They got them from banks.
Funny,
right?
Yeah.
This was a massive boon for banks, and they just haven't stopped feeding at this trough ever since. And every time there's a slight chance of a market downturn, when the government thinks about that, they're not thinking about the homeowners, they're thinking about the banks, right? The banks are so exposed to this one asset class that, and they should have gone down, they should have gone under in 2008, but they were propped up by things like the tripling of the first home buyers grant and the government guarantee on their overseas borrowings. But that was what we started to see was at every stage, the government's prioritized the welfare of the banks. And so here's Albanese now there's been, since what I talked about, there's been this roller coaster of the market. And every time there's a dip, there's another government initiative to prop it back up, push it back up. And who are they thinking about? The banks. And so here's Albanese now. He's bringing forward this policy, crowing about how many young people are going to be brought into the market. Yeah, that's wonderful and good. That's going to happen. But what it's going to do is make the market fundamentally worse because it's going to make it more unaffordable, which has been the constant outcome of all these. And it'll allow the banks to lend to. That's why CBA can make that prediction of 6% mortgage growth, right? They know with policies like this, they have a lot more borrowers now because they only have to pay the 5% deposit. And the conclusion from the housing market, yes, the banksters are in charge.
Yeah, and it's just worth highlighting, isn't it, that the average new mortgage being written is now a lot longer duration. The average mortgage size is a lot bigger than what it used to be. And that's why now we've got 50% of income servicing the mortgage, quite a normal situation now, where it used to be 20 to 30%. And it's fascinating to me, Robbie, that a lot of the banks are saying, we don't see any problems. We're not having a lot of people defaulting. But when you actually look closely, what they're doing is they're actually extending the elastic further and further. And I've sort of termed now this as subscription housing, right? What this basically means is that most people will never actually pay off their mortgage, right? So whether you're actually renting or whether you're actually mortgaging up, you will continue to be a cash flow for the bulk of your life. And that's particularly true because with affordability being so off the scale now, people are forming houses and households a decade later than previously, which means that they are tending to take their mortgages now into retirement as well, which is creating its own problems. And so we've got this debt machine that seems to be perpetual motion for the banks, but it's at the cost of everybody else. And, the analogy I sometimes use is the black hole problem, right? We're getting closer and closer to the black hole. And more of the economy is effectively housing and related housing and lending and all of those things. And the winners, clearly, in all of this are the banks. They are the lenders. Yep. And, we've got big banks that essentially are big building societies. And as I've highlighted before, and we've spoken about before on this channel, there is now a greater proportion of lending going on housing relative to business. If you go back 20 or 30 years, it was completely the other way around. There was more lending going to productive businesses rather than unproductive, inflating housing prices. And then the killer here is as inflation drives house prices higher, they can lend more. As they lend more, their balance sheets expand ever more, which means that they have more capacity to lend even more. So it's got a perpetual motion machine built into it. So whichever way you look at it, this is not a good situation. Now, there's two other observations. The first observation, and I'll just share this little slide because I think it's quite fun. Everything that pushes demand up must make affordability go down. Isaac Newton's theory of repeatedly failed housing policies, right? Which I thought was quite fun. But the other thing is, this isn't just an Australian problem. The point I want to make, and in fact, there was a little bit of a comment earlier on I saw from referring back to the World Economic Forum and the international players. The point is, there is a fundamental philosophical viewpoint underpinning this that effectively means that we are seeing this in many Western countries and other countries too. And if you look carefully, it's the feelers and the controlling mechanisms of the financial system that have expanded and expanded and expanded. And, we sometimes call this neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it.
Yep.
But the financial system isn't working for ordinary people in many countries.
No, the financial system is disconnected from the real economy. It's disconnected from the physical economy. It's disconnected from the needs of people. So it serves itself, and it's run by a class of technocrats who serve a billionaire class, and they're doing really, really well. Thank you very much out of this system, right? And they're definitely not going to change it. In Australia, remember when we talk about our big four banks, never forget that they are now all majority foreign owned. So there's always a statistic cited about how I think it's something like 25% of the shares are held by Australian super funds, and they say, "See, these big profits are benefiting you because they're going to your super funds." Yeah, but something like 60% is held overseas, and so when CBA announces its very generous dividends, that's billions of dollars leaving Australia, right? And where's it going to? It's going to investors. Now, actually, Martin, I just thought about this, because I actually heard a little bit of it the other day. There's a guy here, Punters Politics. You've probably seen his stuff, and he interviewed this London guy, Gary's Economics. You familiar with that guy?
Yep. Yeah.
And I was struck by what he was saying, what Gary's Economics was saying about how these uber rich who just make all their money from assets, they hold assets, and they've got so much money, all they can keep doing is accumulating assets, right? And they're just and they are devouring the earth, is the impression I got. And I'm raising that because I hadn't really thought of that before. But when we raise the WEF, when people have that slogan, "You'll own nothing and be happy," I mean, the WEF wasn't talking about communism. What they were talking about was this, what you said, this subscription housing idea, subscription everything, right? We don't have you don't own anything anymore electronically. It's all subscription, right? They'll the Uber model is don't bother buying a car, just subscribe to one when you need it, that sort of thing, right? That was this idea, this futuristic utopia. But you're getting and I haven't done any work on this, but I'm sure people have all heard about it, and some people would know more than me. But there's this massive buy up of housing by these big funds, like by not BlackRock, the other one, Blackstone, I think they call themselves. A massive buy up of that. I think in America they're becoming this massive owner of housing, and it's all buying up all these investment properties. And this is the asset rich class, devouring more assets. And it's the nature of their system, right? It's got to keep devouring, and it's just eventually it's going to devour everything, and we'll be back to where I think we're always going to end up, and we're in a sense we're there now, which is not it's feudalism, right? We're heading towards feudalism, where corporations and the people who run corporations and the big investors, the billionaires, and we're all serfs in one way or another to that system. What's his name? Friedrich von Hayek thought socialism would lead us to this, but ironically, it's the neoliberalism that he unleashed that I would argue has led us to this feudalism that we're talking about. Because what it did is by denying the legitimacy of government involvement in the economy, people accepted, oh well, the private sector is going to take up all these functions. And by taking up all these functions without any government role and no mechanism for competition with the government, they've just become this unaccountable bureaucratic nightmare, forcing the economy to suit their interests at the expense of all of us. And of course, the banks are at the top of that pile. But you look in Australia, everywhere you look, every sector of the Australian economy, and I point this out to people all the time, and I was talking to a minister of the Tasmanian government this morning. We were discussing this, and he absolutely agreed with me because of his own experience. Everywhere you look in the economy, especially in Australia, but it's we're not that out of step with the rest of the world. The economy is completely concentrated in a handful of corporations in each sector, completely concentrated. And once upon a time, the way we would handle that and make sure it didn't happen is you would have a government player. The government didn't own everything, but the government had a presence in it. You had a government bank, you had a government airline, you had government insurance companies, right? And they kept the private sector honest. In fact, our Prime Minister acknowledged this on 3AW in 2023 when he was talking to Neil Mitchell. He announced that he wouldn't have sold the Commonwealth Bank because you need a public bank to keep the private sector a bit honest. That's the way he put it, right? But his party did sell the Commonwealth Bank. And so we can see in the banking system what the consequences have been. But this is happening everywhere. And yeah, it's a system out of control, and it's headed for disaster. And it's a self-inflicted disaster because it can't help itself, because it's built on this precept that came in the 70s and the 80s that the only obligation corporations have is to their shareholders to maximize profits. And we should talk about this with bank branches, but because of that precept, they've financialized to this crazy degree, and they've ignored the consequences. The guy in our office who reads the papers every day and briefed us this morning, he was pointing out there's an article in the press today about an analysis of the rare earths sector, because the Americans are doing all this hand-wringing over the fact that China monopolizes rare earths production. And it's true, China does. But America used to. And the point of this article was to show America used to. America had the monopoly on rare earths because America was the best at everything. But the people, the corporate overlords who run America, decided that the millions of dollars, even hundreds of millions of dollars from rare earths production wasn't profitable enough. So they stopped prioritizing it. China, which is fundamentally a productive economy, knew that, one, you had to have them, and two, they didn't want to be vulnerable to the rest of the world. So they, decades ago, 30 years ago, they invested in what it takes to produce rare earths. And so as they were prioritizing it, the financial masterminds in America were deprioritizing it because they wanted things that earned them billions of dollars of speculative profits, not hundreds of millions of dollars of boring profits. That's how they think, right? These people are that stupid. They just look at their, That's a lot more money. Stuff that thing, right? Let's create a bubble in internet stocks and get money out of that. That's the priority. Money, maximum money. Oh, this boring thing over here that's going to make sure literally every appliance in your country works. We don't need that. They are that insane. And we are wearing the consequences of that now. And that's why I have zero respect for any corporate boss. Zero. The only person in corporate world I've ever been impressed with is Christine Holgate. But the rest of them, they are lunatics. We are through neoliberalism, we've become financialized lunatics, and we're paying the consequences of that. And the politicians are at their beck and call. And so that's why the Labor Party can shamelessly applaud themselves for this 5% deposit idea, because of the short-term benefits it's going to bring to a handful of young people, and just ignore that they have just continued this tradition of the last 25 years of making the problem much worse.
Yeah, and just to remind everybody, the Treasury makes the point that this will actually lift prices. The first buying guarantee. And of course, they've got other programs as well, the shared equity scheme. Now, Treasury was only saying, it'll be 0.5% over the next few years, but, it's going to be a lot more than that. The problem I've got is that they are pulling a whole bunch of levers in desperation, right? And the reason they've got the problem is because the overall economic momentum in Australia is stalling. Growth is very, very low. The demand potentially for resources is probably going off the boil as well. And the base of our economy has narrowed and narrowed and narrowed. So effectively, we have almost nothing in our armory other than, we've got to build more houses and try and, create some momentum there. So I've always believed that these incentive programs, and remember, this is taxpayers' money, so this is your dollar and my dollar, actually going to effectively help other people, potentially quite affluent people, get into the markets. And there was a piece of research done that showed that a lot of the people would have bought anyway, even if they didn't have a reduced deposit. They would have bought anyway because they've been saving, et cetera, et cetera. But the people who really need the help are below the threshold and won't be helped at all by this program. And in fact, it'll make it worse because it's going to lift prices even higher, which means that the gap is going to be even greater. And that's the sort of the first part of the problem. The other part of the problem I've got is you mentioned this sort of large actors, these big commercial entities around the place hoovering up. In the UK, there's a really interesting debate going on at the moment because, of course, we have very high migration coming into the UK, but we've also got a lot of migration through boats and other illegal means coming into the country. And they've been housed until quite recently in hotels. Now, those hotels are getting a lot of bad flack at the moment. And it's now appearing that what's also happening is some of these large corporations have been buying up cheap properties up in the northern part of the UK and have been effectively offering the government multi-occupancy possibilities in those houses for those asylum seekers. And so once again, when you actually peel back the onion, you've got these large international corporates hoovering up property that would have previously been accessible to the first-time buyers of people in the UK. And it's pretty clear to me that we're seeing similar things going on. So, for example, in Australia, we have the build-to-rent wave with the massive tax breaks, right? Well, guess who are going to be actually benefiting those? The tax breaks come through to those big multinational financial companies who are actually going to effectively charge higher rents, and they won't be providing a vast amount of housing for those who really need it. There'll be, again, those who can probably afford to pay in any case. So to my mind, we can see how this is playing out, and ordinary people are being left further and further behind. The worrying point that I have is that we've now got to the point where there is a generational expectation of a much higher level of debt just being normal. So over time, this ever greater demand on our finances for housing has become normalized. And The banks love it, of course, because as I said earlier on, they can create bigger loans and grow their balance sheets and grow their profits. But it means that the overall economy is being sucked dry because people have less disposable income available for other things. And every time they pull the lever and sort of say, well, we'll provide a bit more of a leeway for more people to come in, I call this performative politics. This is no more than sounding as though they're doing something to help when they're not. And, you mentioned the Productivity Commission, other research has been done, not just in Australia, but elsewhere, to highlight that these incentive programs do not work. They simply push property prices higher. They make it more difficult for people to actually get into the market. And whilst there are a small proportion of people who can benefit at the taxpayer's expense, the overall debt level of the government continues to rise, which will then cause, guess what? We then need to see Chalmers saying, well, we've got to find other ways to try and actually square the circle. So why don't we raise some superannuation, and why don't we think about other things like property taxes or, spare room taxes and those sorts of things? Because the government is now backed into a corner where it's having to fund more and more of this housing sort of support mechanism from taxpayer funds. Taxpayers are already being taxed to high heaven, and now they're looking for other tax strategies based on assets. And I have a real problem with that, because we're fundamentally, again, shifting the conversation about where we're going to find. And then the final point I want to highlight, Chalmers has now been talking about the intergenerational problem that's been created. And I believe that what we're seeing from our politicians now is an overt attempt to whitewash people by trying to blame the older Australians against the younger Australians. So it's not the government policy over the last 40 years that you mentioned earlier on. It's those greedy older people who've got these assets that they're the problem. We've got to actually tax them harder to try and actually restore balance.
Yeah.
The politicians are now, frankly, telling us porkies, I think. But what they're doing is creating intergenerational tensions in the process. So, to my mind, it's another excuse.
And I've seen those intergenerational tensions expressed. Not that long ago, actually, I was in a Zoom conversation consulting with a couple, and it was a political conversation, and there was a reason both of them were on the conversation, and they were expressing their frustration at how hard it is to buy a house in Sydney, and they are a professional couple. And then the conversation went to their anger at their aunt or their great aunt who lives alone in an apartment or a house somewhere in Sydney, and it's a large residence, and she lives alone, and she's lived there for 50, 60 years, and they can't get a house, and they're looking at what she's got, and they were expressing how envious they were, and more than envious, that how unfair it was that she had that and they can't get something. And I remember about 5 years ago, Martin, I was visiting Sydney, and I had to catch up with an acquaintance of mine who worked in the city in finance. And when I got there, they were just about to have a presentation by an investment banker, and I was just asked to sit in on it. And this investment banker was talking about the future of the the accommodation problem, and how they needed to address it by forcing these elderly people out of the homes that they'd always lived in. And you know how elderly people think, right? So they've lived in their home, but they've raised a family in that home, and it's still their family home, and it's somewhere for the grandkids to come. I mean, my grandfather had a 3-bedroom home or whatever in Western Victoria, and that was the focal point for the extended family. Where do we get together? At his place, right? And yeah, plenty of days in the week he was just him there alone, but plenty of time he was there with that's the cultural thing, the cultural mortar that binded us all together, right? Was our focus, the family focus, and at that particular place. This is how culture works. And these investment bankers just looking at numbers, are saying, oh, the way we'll have incentives, we'll have taxes and whatever, and we'll force these people out of their homes that lived in for generations, and then they can make way for younger people and whatever. And it was sounding great to them on paper, their scheme, and they would have had some way to make profit out of it. I'm sure that was part of the pitch. I just remember thinking, you people are bastards. You're so out of touch here. You don't actually want to solve the real problem, right? You don't want to address this housing issue in an orderly way. Because if you addressed it in an orderly way, you would go back to what used to work. And we've done a lot of work on this. I think you did a show with Elisa, my wife, about this back in the day when we actually built proper public housing, right? And it was a major part of the state government's responsibility. And for a long time there, it was funded by the Commonwealth Bank. The Commonwealth lent to the states, and the states build the housing. And in a state like South Australia, the Housing Trust of South Australia was the biggest property developer in the state, and it turned a profit. Its ongoing operations didn't cost the South Australian taxpayer a cent, and it provided. And as it's one of those things, you do the research and you highlight these stories, and then people who benefited from those systems come forward and say, because they hear it, they say, yeah, I lived in that, right? This is how it affected my family. And we stopped doing all of that, right? Now, when you have a proper, healthy public housing sector, it's a dampener on house price growth, as it should be. And that's the other thing you just said then, Martin, that generationally people have become used to the idea of high debt, and they've also become used to the idea of rapidly growing asset prices, as if that's the normal, and it shouldn't be the normal. And then think about this, it just occurred to me when you were talking. In 2001, when John Howard felt the need to introduce the $7,000 first home buyers grant, the original one, what was the ratio of housing to income then? It was about 4-1. What was the actual need? Like, where was the political impetus for that? Where was the urgency? What was the crisis driving that policy decision? That it wasn't any, right? Not by today's standards, at least. 4-1. Everyone could afford to buy a house. That's why the grant was so low, only $7,000. By 2004, the grant was useless because housing had become so expensive. The $7,000, it had doubled in price or whatever. $7,000 barely touched the side of what the first home buyers needed. But that's what set us off. And now people are expect high debt, high incomes, and consequently, because the banks are focused entirely on that, what we don't have is productivity, and that's one of the that's part of the context I'd like to talk about the banks and branches, because what are the banks doing when they're shutting down all these branches around Australia? They're increasing their paper productivity, i.e. their profits for their outlays, at the expense of Australia's productivity, right? All these small businesses have to go much further to do their banking because the banks don't care about serving them anymore. They're just only caring about themselves. Also, if the banks aren't going to lend to productive industries, and they hardly do, as you cited those figures before, our friend Wilson Sy came up with that great graph about the the proportion of bank lending to businesses as opposed to mortgages in the 90s, early 90s. It was 30% to mortgages, 70% to businesses. It is now totally flipped over. It is 70% to mortgages and 30% to businesses. Even though businesses are the ones that pay the employees who have the mortgages. But if you're not going to be lending to businesses, what are you doing to productivity there? Right? There's so much potential productivity in Australia. It just needs to be backed. It just needs to be financed. That's the job of the banks. They're the ones, they control the reins of credit, and they're not directing it into the productive areas. They're only focusing on the speculation in one asset class. And, it's one of the reasons we're absolutely stuffed. And it doesn't change because the government does their bidding.
Absolutely, unfortunately. And I just want to highlight this idea of perpetual debt. When I survey younger households, they now are assuming that debt is the default position to be in, multiple debts, credit cards, etc., etc. But they're assuming that that'll always be the case. And of course, it starts with the student debt. Now, okay, I quite like this. Cut your student debt by 20%, which Michael fixed it by forcing other taxpayers to pay for it, right? So that it's a two-sided street. But the point is that the whole concept here of student debt. So when you start when you're young, you acquire debt, and you continue to pay debt, and you continue to have to borrow through the whole of your life. We are now conditioned to thinking that is the default state.
Yep.
And the people who are the winners from that conditioning are those big financial firms that we've been talking about, who love it because, of course, it's such easy money. And I have to say, there's a sort of mystique about the finance system and the banking system. It is blooming easy, because basically all you need to do is to find a greater mug to lend some more money to. And the more money that you can lend, the more you can inflate your balance sheet. The more you can inflate your balance sheet, the more you can lend. So it is a perfect Ponzi scheme. And yet that is not how banking is actually being spoken about, but it should be spoken about. And it's actually at the negative outcome that we've been talking about, which means that people have less funds to spend on other things. They have to, leverage up even more. The average mortgage now is 6, 7, 8 times 2 incomes, not 1 income. Go back a couple of decades, it was 3.5 times 1 income, and maybe second income if you needed it, that sort of thing. So a massive change there. And the net consequence of all this is negative rather than positive. Now, you mentioned, and this is now sort of segueing the conversation forward, the branch story, because I think we do have to come to look specifically at the branch story too. Because I noticed the other day there was an article suggesting that we should be building another 140,000 homes in regional areas across Australia as part of this 1.2 million target, right? And my immediate thought was, well, hang on a moment. You're going to build in those areas, but what are people going to do? Where are the jobs? And how are they going to get by if they don't have any bank branches to be able to actually do their banking and those sorts of things? Because, of course, regional Australia is being strangled left, right, and centre. All the research shows when you close the branch, you close the town as well. Yep. And we've seen over the last few years a massive, massive issue with regard to branch closures. And, of course, we should focus in specifically, I think, at the most recent examples here, because there is a really, really sad, concerning, disgraceful story that we should be talking about relating to particularly Bendigo.
Yep. So 2020, February 23 to May 2024, the Senate Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport Committee conducted an excellent inquiry into branch closures in regional Australia. How do I know it was excellent? I was there. I was the eyewitness to every single hearing, the only person in Australia who attended every single hearing. And Dale Webster tells me I should tell people that, Martin. She thinks that's quite an accomplishment. And I went all around Australia doing it. And by the time I got to, I remember the hearing in Tom Price up in northern WA. When I turned up there, and the senators who are all paid by the taxpayer to go there, by the way, so their travel was paid by the taxpayer. They got extra income for attending the hearings. I was not paid by any of that. I was funded by the Citizens Party to participate in these things, but that's okay. It was an excellent process, and it produced an excellent report, right? And you monitored it closely. You helped get it started. Dale Webster helped get it started, and we were very, very happy with the outcome. The 3 leading recommendations were make access to banking and cash an essential service, which is a legal obligation on both the banks and the government if it's designated an essential service. Establish an expert panel to look at a public bank, including the postal bank model, which we advocate for, and make the banking code of practice mandatory instead of voluntary. I give it real teeth. And then there's a bunch of other recommendations as well, including ones from Andy Schmulo, who was our candidate in the New South Wales in the recent Senate election, federal election. Andy, I got to know Andy through this inquiry, and Andy made a big impact with his contribution to that. So it was an excellent process. The report was handed down 14 months ago. And what have we heard? Crickets. Now, there's been some stuff behind the scenes, and the most exciting thing was a headline in the Australian a year ago, August 2024, that said postal bank back on Labor's agenda. We don't even know the context in which that article was run, and it pointed out that Bill Shorten had been interested in the postal bank, and thanks to the inquiry, postal bank was back on Labor's agenda. Well, we were happy to see that because we're the ones who put it back on Labor's agenda, right? That was our campaign. But apart from that, nothing, no actual response to the inquiry, even though by law, the government is required to respond in 90 days. So we're now coming up to 15 months that there has been no response to this inquiry. And so what happens? Without responding to the inquiries, Jim Chalmers announced that the big four banks had agreed to a moratorium. Westpac and CBA already had a moratorium on branch closures. ANZ and NAB came on board and agreed to a 3-year moratorium. Now, it was such a cheap announcement, mainly for this reason. It's great working with Dale Webster. She's such a gun as a journalist. She's done so much work on this question for quite a few years now. And she knows all the history of this, and she knows all the reports. And she wrote an article about this. She pointed out that in 1999, when the very first parliamentary inquiry into bank closures was conducted, and a lot of stuff it was a good inquiry as well. Anthony Albanese was on that inquiry, interestingly enough. When the report came out, the banks responded how? By pledging not to close branches for 3 years. In other words, what Jim Chalmers announced as his solution at the start of this year was a trick that the banks had already tried before. This time, the smart thing the banks achieved was they got Jim Chalmers to think it was his idea, right? But anyway, and of course, because it's not a clever idea, he only made it apply to the big four. So along comes Bendigo Bank. Now, Martin, have you got that first graphic, just to show the audience that I've done a bit of preparation for this? And while you're getting it, I just want to have a crack at Drew Peacock. Drew, I told Martin, I don't know if you were here, I told Martin at the beginning of this, I wasn't going to let you provoke me into losing my temper. So don't try and goad me.
So which one do you want first, Robbie? Do you want
the Fennell, Richard Fennell?
Yeah. Now, this is, I'm hoping that the viewers can read that a bit. So anyway, the essential thing with this is the new CEO of Bendigo Bank, but this is his profile from 2009, around the time he joined the bank. He became the CEO last year. But if you look at his profile, look at his background already. And there's two things that stand out. One, he was from PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, aka part of the pinstriped mafia. That's what Lord Prem Sikka in the UK called them in a 2018 report. These consulting firms, the pinstripe mafia. And what do these consulting firms do? Apologies to Martin. He used to have this background, but he survived the horrors of Arthur Anderson, and he's become a decent human being since. They sit around and devise schemes to make money, right? It's not what are their metrics? The health and well-being of the people in the economy, or money. Clearly, it's money. By the way, did you see Martin Deloitte got caught out using AI to the government? The Australian government's paid them millions of dollars to write a report on robo calculation of welfare or something. Yeah, that's right.
And they use bloody AI to do it. And as usual, AI made up the references reading the report, and there's all these impressive looking references, and they're all made up because these lazy bastards at Deloitte want to just pocket the money and not even do the work for the money.
Yeah.
Right. Anyway.
Just let me interrupt. Anderson, right? I worked in Anderson for a brief period of time. It took me 3 weeks to understand just how rotten the place was once I was there. 3 weeks,
there
right? So from the outside, it looked like a really interesting and exciting place, and they were very interested in all the work I'd done specifically with the evolution of the internet and digital banking and all of those sorts of things. And so they were quite excited to have me, and I was quite excited to talk about that stuff. But immediately it became clear that the only people that they were interested in was actually prospering their own ends, right? And they would do anything to actually do that. They would make stuff up. They would repurpose audit reports in a particular way for particular purposes, etc., etc. It was just innate, and it was going right back to what you said earlier on, because they were only interested in the commercial aspect of making money. That's the only thing they were interested in. It doesn't matter about truth. It doesn't matter about reality. It doesn't matter whether it's the right thing or the good thing for the community. No. This is about pure commercial making money. And it took me 3 weeks to work that out.
And these guys rule the economies of the Western world.
Yep.
That they've been allowed to be in literally every process of everything, and especially government processes, right? So anyway, there's a certain type of person, jumped out as comes from PwC, but he also comes from Richard Fennell, also comes from IBM. Now, both of those.
And just to say, there's this slide which I'll put up now, because basically his view. This is Eric Johnson's piece, right? Yeah. Bendigo is now planning to be a new big bank, running to be a new big bank. So they want to be like the others, right? That's the number one thing that he said, right? Which is amazing.
Keep that on the screen, because people might see some of it. So if you look at the bottom of in the one with the larger text there, the first part, if you look at the very last line of the third column, that's about to report that it's running at 7.3% return on equity.
Yes.
Now, understand this. The viewers need to understand this. Australia's banks, big four banks, are the most profitable banks in the world. So, and they're running at about 11% return on equity, and maybe sometimes a little bit less. And they come down a bit from what they were a few years ago. I think they got to 16% and whatever. But anyway, nevertheless, they're still the most profitable bank in the world. The big four banks in Australia make more profit than the banks in the UK, which is a much bigger economy. So that's 7.3% of Bendigo. That is actually normal by global standards, right? It's just a bit lower than the big four banks here. But talk about expectations and conditioning like before. People are conditioned to accept more debt, expect higher, returns on like property going up. In Australia, we're conditioned to expect our banks to make mega profits. And so this guy Richard Fennell gets away with saying the 7.3% is not enough. Is that a profit? Yes, it's a damn profit. Does it cover their cost? Yes, it covers their cost, right? Oh, but that's not enough. We've got to be in the league of the big banks. And of course, how's he going to do it? Well, he's in the middle of this big structural adjustment, and the branch closures are part of that structural adjustment. And I suspect with his background at IBM, he had this. He was planning to do this all along, right? Let's go force people to go digital. And he's talking about digital only, like they've got a whole new computer system now where everyone can make deposits digitally and just have a totally digital engagement with the bank. And we're going to be the new big bank. And as part of that, and this is really crucial, because this shows you how they don't care at all. They have they've announced 10 branch closures and 28 agency closures. 5 of the branches are the last bank in town. 17 of the agencies are the last genuine banking services in town, apart from Bank of Post. And that means 22 of these 38 are losing this month, next month, and the month after. In one fell swoop, Bendigo Bank is taking away the last genuine banking service in 22 towns in Australia. And Dale Webster pointed out that not even any of the big four banks, Martin, have done it that aggressively at their worst. Just in one fell swoop, we're taking these away. Hang the consequences, right? Hang the consequences. And that's where there are consequences. There absolutely are. Now, sorry, if you just jump back to that previous one, I wanted to highlight something else, because this is where the details are important, and the average journo who covers this has no idea. In that, on that second page, people might not be able to read it, but he actually tries to cover his ass by saying that, but even though they're doing this massive branch closure spree, they're still committed to branches, because he said Bendigo has 400 branches, which is the third most of any bank in Australia, right? And see, we're committed to branches. But what he doesn't point out about those branches, at least 250 of the 400, it might be 290. The figures are in Dale Webster's. Go to the regional.com and .au and you can read these figures. That's where Dale Webster publishes the stuff. 250 or 290 of them are community banks. That means they're not costing Bendigo a cent. The local community is paying for them. Bendigo just provides the banking service, right? So the local community puts up all the costs for the community bank. By the way, they're profitable for the community. That's why they do them. They're not costing Bendigo Bank a cent. And so when Bendigo still takes credit, when they cite that $400 figure, 400 branch figure to balance out the branch closures that they're announcing, right? This is them actually, in a sense, misrepresenting themselves, right? They're trying to trade on past glories. They built a reputation in the 90s. I was there. I saw it. As soon as the Commonwealth Bank was privatized, straight away, all the big four went on a branch closing spree, and they laid off thousands of employees and whatever. Some of you old enough may remember that. Bendigo made a name for itself by stepping in and filling that niche, and especially with the community banking model. And our party was the People's Bank Party, and we were pushing the People's Bank idea. And people were saying to us, "Do you mean Bendigo Bank?" Because they stepped up to provide a service in these towns, and that's where they got their good reputation from. And that bastard, that pinstripe mafia bastard, who's doing this to 22 towns in Australia and stuffing another 16, he's trying to have his cake and eat it too by continuing to trade on the good name of Bendigo from way back, which he is not committed to anymore. Bendigo doesn't do the community banking model anymore. No, all these desperate areas have turned to Bendigo Bank when they've been abandoned by the big four banks. Can you do a community bank? No, not interested. They'll say, "Oh no, you got to guarantee $100 million in loans." Well, as if they can do that, right? And I reckon of all the banks that Bendigo's about, all the towns Bendigo's about to abandon, the most egregious is Queenstown. And we've got to tell this story because it's quite extraordinary. I got in touch with the people of Queenstown, and 2 weekends ago or 3 weekends ago, I had a very big weekend. I was flying to Sydney and back, and I flew to Sydney for a speech on the Saturday morning. I had to come back to Melbourne on Saturday night and do a speech down here to the licensed post office group. And then at 4:00 the next morning, I had to get up, catch the 6 a.m. flight to Hobart, and then drive 4 hours. Someone picked me up, a Citizens Party supporter, Ray Williams, picked me up and drove me 4 hours west to Queenstown. Because there was a protest that Sunday, and I wanted to make sure we were there to address the protest, and I was the main speaker at the protest because of my experience with the regional bank closures inquiry. But we've got a video, Martin, of the drive to town, which is really, I mean, when you actually put yourself there and experience what the town's going through, it is really infuriating. Because have a look at this. This is the approach to Queenstown. Now, plenty of the people on here may be familiar with Queenstown and these hills. These hills used to be bald from all the chemicals from mining, and some of the vegetation's coming back. But this was even though this was winter, this was a nice day in Queenstown. But look how bendy and windy that road is. Really, really, really windy. And often it's icy. And if you look up Queenstown on Facebook, there's a whole Facebook page dedicated to the locals reporting to each other the state of the roads. And by Bendigo Bank pulling out of Queenstown, they're telling the people, so this is the road from the south from Hobart going in. The road north going to Burnie, where the closest bank is 2.5 hours away, is just as bad for about 40 kilometers. And when it's wet and cold, it's often icy, and these are and it can snow. These are intimidating roads. I'm not a a scared bunny driver, but these are intimidating roads. And if you're an elderly person, etc., you can imagine how intimidating they are. Burnie's 150 kilometers away, but it takes 2.5 hours to get there. Such is the nature of the roads. And so when Bendigo Bank pulls out of Queenstown, the last bank on the entire west coast of Tasmania, the last bank for 20 towns on the west coast of Tasmania, they're condemning the people of Queenstown to that. And do you think the executives of Bendigo Bank even know about it, let alone care? I absolutely doubt it. Do you think Prime Minister Albanese knows about it, let alone cares? Well, I hope he'll tell you he cares, but I know he doesn't know about it because he goes to whoever said, by the way, those roads are 110k. Yeah, they do the Targa Tasmania. They do the Targa Tasmania rally through those roads. Ray Williams, who took me there, has actually done the Targa Tasmania rally. He's a rally car driver and a racing car driver. But they only do them uphill, so they actually have some safety that way. Albanese has gone to Queenstown quite a bit to visit the West Coast for the elections and stuff. He flies in. He's not driven that road. I drove it 30 years ago with Elisa for our honeymoon when we got married in October. We've been married 30 years this year. So in October 1995, we drove around Tasmania for our honeymoon. And it was really, I had remembered the roads from then, but going back on them, realizing that, hang on, now the people just to do their banking are condemned to that, right? And these people don't give a stuff about what they're doing to the locals. Now, that's bad, but there's an alternative. And can we have a look at the next video, please, Martin? All right, so we don't have audio for this, but I took this video. This is TikTok style. I hope all you people are my fans on TikTok as well. You may as well get on there to watch Robbie's rants. So there's the Bendigo branch there, just a little shop front in Queenstown, and that's the post office. Look how magnificent that's directly across the street. There's Ray, my driver. I'm a Citizens Party candidate down there, Ray Williams. That's directly across the street from the Bendigo branch. And if you look back at the building, they're only using 1/4 of it. Down the bottom, half of the bottom floor is in use. The rest is empty. It could make a magnificent postal bank. Now, that green building there, that's the Hunters Hotel. And here's what I love about Queenstown. King O'Malley, the founder of the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, represented Queenstown in the Australian Parliament at Federation. He used to stand on that balcony talking to the voters in the street below about the need for a government bank for Australia, a national bank. That's where he sold the national bank to the Australian people. And that's what we're trying to do. And it just so happens that the flagship town of this campaign is the town where the Commonwealth Bank had its genesis. And look at that beautiful post office. There's my mate, Ray. That post office could serve the whole area. But then I since discovered something else. Those 20 towns, Martin, that only have Queenstown to do their banking in, they all have a post office. If we had a postal bank in Australia, every post office in Australia could provide full service banking and stuff what the private banks want to do. And I'll tell you what they will do. They'll come back in because they will not be able to afford to let so many potential customers go to the bank that's going to serve them. And that's one of the beauties of a postal bank. But that's what you're dealing with. And there's a few things that's come to a head there. One is the intention of this pinstripe mafia and these gangsters who've taken over the banks to just force us to this shift to digital banking and so that they can make maximum profits. And the second one is the lack of intention by the government to actually do anything. And it's epitomized by Albanese and Chalmers sitting on their hands for 14 months. And because of that, Bendigo Bank knew that they could go along and announce these branch closures without any consequences. That's what you're dealing with.
Yeah, it is remarkable, isn't it? When you think about the history of Australia and the way that Australia thrived through that regional network
Yep.
supported by the local bank and the local community, the local post office, all of those things. That was part of what made Australia as prosperous. And of course, a lot of the wealth of Australia is in those regional areas.
It is.
So it doesn't really fit very well into the 15-minute city, aspiration of some, right? That wants everybody corralled into these large areas, and stop them having cars and stop them getting around. There's a real world out there that requires support to maintain commercial viability.
Well, let me describe the West Australian economy that's being abandoned now by the banks. I mean, Bendigo's the last one, right? But all the banks have abandoned. This is the West Tasmanian economy. Actually, Martin, this is a really good example of the Citizens Party supporters who are so invested in this campaign. Graham Medhurst from Western Australia, Perth, sent this summary to me of the economy around Queenstown, because he's as invested in helping to save Queenstown as the people of Queenstown is. So he makes the point that they have a flourishing industrial economy there. The Rosebery mine produces around 110,000 tonnes per annum of zinc, and that is annual revenue of around $440 million. The Savage River mine produces 2 million tonnes per annum of high-grade magnetite, annual revenue of $340 million. The Renison tin mine produces around 10,000 tonnes per annum of concentrate tin, annual revenue of about $500 million. The Henty gold mine produces, better put my glasses on here, gold of around 30,000 ounce per annum, annual revenue of $150 million. Salmon production in Macquarie Harbour is about $150 million. Tourism revenue on the West Coast is around $65 million. There's forestry, there's hydropower, and there's fishing. But he says all up, it adds up to about $2 billion of actual production that comes out of Tasmania. More importantly, this is because it's mostly exported, right? This is earning foreign exchange for Australia. This is incredibly productive for us, and the people in that area work in all those industries, work in those mines. Now, so there's about 4,500 people live in those, distributed on the west coast of Tasmania, which doesn't seem a lot, but it expands greatly in tourism season. And I mean greatly. There's festivals and stuff, and it expands. So all of these people they've got a festival coming up, I think in November in Queenstown, and they don't know where they're going to get the cash from, because there won't be a bank now to get cash from, right? And that's all being abandoned by the banks, even though it's such a valuable part of the economy. But get this. I've learned, Martin, there's three types of politicians. There's the evil conspirators who are selling us all out. There's politicians who really care and are trying to stop it and really want to serve their community, and they're a minority. And there's a third type of politician who can be pushed to do something about these things, but only for the political gain. They're only interested in the political gain. And one of those I'm about to name, and I've said his name on your show before, Martin, positively. And I'm about to say his name and call him out. And that is Senator Richard Colbeck, Tasmanian Senator Richard Colbeck. Now, before I met Richard Colbeck, my only experience of him was when he was the aged care minister during COVID. And remember, there was political blaming. I don't care about the political blame game, right? Labor made hay about the deaths on his watch in aged care. You remember that he performed really poorly in Parliament in trying to answer these accusations, and he looked like a real deal. But you learn in politics. Certainly, I have. You can have a view of people from what you see on the media, but it's always a caricature, and you've got to be open to the possibility that they're different. So my direct experience was in the branch closures inquiry, because he participated in probably about half the hearings, and as he participated, I saw that he was getting with the program, responding to what was laid out to him, and actually, you could see it in his questions. They were more incisive, right? He was really putting the banks on the spot, and he did some good work. By the last hearing in Tom Price in Western Australia, I said to him, I don't mean to sound patronising, Senator, but you've gotten better. And he goes, well, when you start an inquiry like this, you're a bit of a blank slate. And then as you learn, you actually start to see what's going on. Because I knew when the inquiry started, all these senators were giving the banks the benefit of the doubt. By the end of the inquiry, they weren't. They were scathing because they saw that they'd been gaslighting the whole country, claiming that people didn't want branches anymore. And if that was true, why were so many people coming to these hearings, right? Anyway, that was while the inquiry was on. It's now 14 months later. His state is in a crisis. Half of his state is about to lose its last branch. He has done and said nothing. Absolutely nothing. I've been trying to contact him. Absolutely nothing. And this is a politician who can only respond in the heat of the moment. He is not fundamentally motivated by a care for his community. That's the biggest problem in Parliament in Australia. It's not the minority who are just evil ideologues, who are just, there's not that many of them, right? But there's some real bastards in there. It's this set that just play politics for the game. And so, they had the power of government to be able to act, and they refused to act. I do want to compliment, unfortunately we missed Jared Rennick. He lost his seat at the last election, but Jared is the guy who got up that Senate inquiry. Jared was there to make a difference. In Tasmania, the minister in the Rockcliffe government, Gavin Pearce, is the state member for that area. And he was the federal member before this 2022 election. He got elected to the state parliament in this last Tassie election. He has been turning heaven and earth to try and get some action to save Queenstown, and he's been. I've been working with him closely. He genuinely wants to fix it, right? Because and you can see that in the way he's working so hard to do it. Even though he's a government minister now and he's frightfully busy with he's the Minister of Agriculture in the state. But they're a different breed. The rest of them are so much like Richard Colbeck. And then the most surprising one was Jackie Lambie. Jackie Lambie, who stomps her feet at the drop of a hat, she was emailed impact statements by the people in the town of Queensland, and her reply was from her office, "No, government can't really do anything about banking. Just learn to adjust to the new system the banks are trying to get you to adjust to." That was Jackie Lambie, right? And I was sorry, I just got completely disgusted because I thought she will crack up in Parliament at the slightest thing. And she's a senator from Tasmania. Here's a real issue, and she's already conditioned to spruik the impotent government line, and I just found that unforgivable. But that's the difference. But that's why one of the issues here is we're going to have to change the system. And by the system I mean the people in the system. We need new blood. We need that 33% of Australians who are voting against the major parties to keep growing, and we need better people in Parliament who will actually take on these institutions, because right now the two major parties are hardwired not to. Now, that doesn't mean you can't push the needle. So last month, Andy Schmulo and I hope everyone knows who I'm talking about with Andy Schmulo, Associate Professor Andy Schmulo, we spent a week in Canberra. We fired this issue up, and we got a lot of attention on this issue. We got people raising it in Parliament. We got the Queenstown Council to pass a motion calling on the government to respond to the Senate inquiry. This was raised in the chamber as well. The Nationals court took them a bit, but then they jumped on the bandwagon about 2 weeks later, and the shadow financial services minister Pat Conahan led the Nationals. They all signed a letter to Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese saying, when are you going to respond? They were talking about the Bendigo Bank closure and saying, when are you going to respond to the Senate inquiry? So this is a theme that we started with our campaign, and they all started jumping on the bandwagon. Last Thursday, the people of Queenstown, under our direction, had a day of action, and they covered it on the radio and the local press, and a lot of people got involved, where we instructed them, call Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese's office, and we gave them the numbers. And we got Citizens Party supporters all around Australia to do the same thing on that day. We called it a day of action, and we bombarded those two offices saying, what are you going to do to save Queenstown? the last bank on the west coast of Tasmania. Now, and I can tell you, we actually melted their phones down, right? And the people of Queenstown were really happy and really fired up about it. But that's just part of the action that we're taking. We need some results. It's no good just being happy about that people have participated in the action. What we're trying to do this week, Martin, is there's two questions. There's two drafted questions floating around Parliament that we're hoping either one or the other gets asked in question time to the Treasurer or the Prime Minister. It's demanding what are you going to do to respond to the Senate inquiry into regional banking? And at a certain point, the combination of all these things, the pressure is building. 7:30 reports covered it 2 weeks ago. ABC in Tasmania covered it last night. A lot of print media has covered it. There is pressure on this issue. Bendigo Bank apparently is complaining about the bad press that they've been receiving. And I said to the people of Queenstown, do not take this outcome as a given, right? There is, with the right pressure, and the pressure needs to be on the government to pressure the bank. With the right pressure, there is a chance to get Bendigo Bank to reverse its decision here, just like Westpac reversed a number of decisions during the Senate inquiry into branch closures, and just like Commonwealth Bank reversed its decision on Junee. Remember Junee? There's a chance we can do that with Bendigo Bank. Because even though I think the solution is create a postal bank, that's going to take a while. And on the 26th of September, Bendigo Bank is going to close in Queenstown. And then even though, get this, Martin, the rent on their office doesn't run out until June next year. They're going to keep paying rent on an empty building. And they prefer to do that rather than provide a service to the town. That's the kind of people you're talking about. So, but there's scope there if the government brings pressure to bear, and I want to use the next graphics. I mean, I'll get your feedback first, but it's nearly time because I want to illustrate this more. But I'm going to show an example in a minute where when the banks are pissed off, they don't hesitate to call the government. They've got Jim Chalmers' mobile number. They call him up directly and say, Jim, back off. Jim, you're not doing this. So my argument, Martin, is how come the government can't do that to the banks? And if there's ever a town, you're talking about the last bank on the whole west of one state. If there's ever a circumstance where the Treasurer should muscle up and call the bank and say, you're not going to do this, it's Queenstown. So we're bringing pressure. We're making it as big as possible. Hopefully we'll get that question asked, and we'll see if we can make them break.
Yeah, well, it's just very important, and keep the pressure up. All of the research shows that if you don't have the commercial capacity in a town or in a community, it dies. And it's something that has been evident not just in Australia, but in other places too. So this is and I saw somebody earlier on saying, well, to get on with the phone banking, etc. Well, there are things you can't do on the phone banking, and I can pretty be sure that the connectivity over in the west coast of Tassie is not flash.
Let me describe it to you. So it's really advanced. It's 4G.
Oh wow!
You drive now. So when that footage you saw of me on the road, I didn't have any reception then, but then you come around the corner and then over in the distance you can see this tower and you get 4G reception. But the mayor of the town in the protest meeting, he revealed something I found quite humorous. At 3:30 every day, the internet of the town effectively crashes. You know why?
No, tell me. Can't imagine. What 3:30? What's school?
The school kids get out of school and get on their devices. Everything goes.
Yes.
And they want that town to be 100% digital bank.
Yeah.
It's just I have zero respect that these guys, they get some MBA or something to qualify them to become CEOs, whatever the hell it is. They have such a narrow focus. They got no idea of the real world, and yet and it's like getting angry at a shark for eating a person or a wild animal or whatever. There's only you're going to still trust me. If it ever happens to you, your friend, you're still going to get angry at the shark, but there's a limit. It's futile, right? They're going to do what they're going to do. We need to get angry at the government that has vacated the field and left the welfare of Australians up to these bastards. And that's what we've got to bring back, public institutions that can actually serve people, regardless of what they do. But what will happen is by them serving people properly, it sets a standard that these private institutions know they have to live up to. And that's the only way we're going to fix it.
Yeah, and this is take us quite nicely into our last point that, of course, the banks, if they have something presented at them which they don't like, well, they are extremely effective and very powerful at lobbying, right? And here's a wonderful story just to illustrate the ridiculousness of this.
So have a look at, can you bring up the number, so Andy Schmulo likes highlighting this one, right? I want to tell this story, and I'm going to name names because I was there. So this is one of the best examples you'll see of just how powerful, how the banks run the government in Australia. And I'll give you the actual articles in a second. But the reason I've done it this way, so when I was quickly looking up these articles for this discussion, and see, I've used Google, and look what I've Googled: SMH $1 million fines for bankers, because I remember how the headlines work. So 23rd of November 2022, see that in green? And the first headline, $1 million fines for dodgy bankers. And then look at the next search result, 24th of November 2022, literally the next day. Headline, $1 million fines dumped after bankers raised, quote, legitimate concerns. You can't hear that. And you see the lowercase, you see the smaller text there. A surprise plan to threaten finance executives with $1.1 million fines has been pulled from Parliament after a ferocious response from the banks. So let me tell the story. 23rd of November 2022, I'm in Parliament, and I'm in Parliament with Glenn Isherwood from our office, but also John Adams. John was in Parliament that day, and I was I had made an arrangement to meet with an advisor of the Greens, the late Fraser Brindley. He passed away a few years ago, the next year actually. But Fraser was the smartest guy in the Parliament I ever met. He was advisor. He was at the time he was an advisor to Senator Nick McKim for the Greens, and Nick McKim has the finance portfolio of the Greens. And not because of Fraser. What the reason Fraser and I got on is because even though he was a Green, and I'm definitely not a Green, but he had the same focus on cleaning up financial corruption as we do, and the question of fines for bankers had come out of the Hayne Royal Commission, the Banking Royal Commission. And this was a question of when you hear ASIC announce that it's fined a bank for more misconduct, that's the shareholders of the bank paying that fine. The people who actually committed the misconduct never pay the fine. There's no accountability for them. And Hayne recommended, no, you need a financial accountability regime so the executives who are culpable in this sometimes horrible examples of misconduct, really horrible, like the really egregious one is Westpac and the money and they're just and their breaches of the anti-money laundering laws, which, as Andy Schmulo points out in a lot of graphic detail, involved hundreds of thousands of cases of Australians transferring money for pay-per-view live-streamed child pornography from the Philippines. And Westpac was letting these transfers go through and not asking and ignoring the requirement to disclose them. And the executives at Westpac had been warned by AUSTRAC about that. And so that's an example where those executives who, when this was later found out, Westpac paid a $1.9 billion fine. It was a huge fine, and they deserved it. But the shareholders paid that fine. What happens to the executives? Nothing. And so Hayne had said there needs to be accountability for executives. So remember, the Hayne Royal Commission report came down in March 2019. Remember the footage of Justice Hayne and Frydenberg at the table,
Yes.
and Frydenberg wanted to shake his hand, and Hayne wouldn't smile at all. I mean, I always think Hayne was looking to the future, knowing what a dog's breakfast that they'd make of this. That was 2019. This was in 2022, 2.5 years later, that they were finally getting around to pass it. And the only reason why is because Albo got elected, and the Greens, he needed the Greens vote on something. The Greens said, "Well, you're going to pay. You got to pass this." Right, and Albo agreed. So, but then what? So if you can bring up number one, and if you look there, I've highlighted in yellow there. The Greens won government support for the changes, which will be added to the legislation before Parliament early next week. So this was all set in stone. And I really like this Nick McKim quote. He said, we're really happy to have secured $1 million fines for dodgy bank executives. I mean, you know, when you finally push the government to do the right thing, right? Of course, you're going to be happy. But then what happened the next day? You see on the next page. No, sorry, this one. Yeah, this one. The very next day, $1 million fine. Oh, sorry, before I go back to that. So I'm in Parliament and I sit down with Fraser, and John Adams was in the discussion, and Glenn from our office is in the discussion, and Fraser was jumping out of his skin. He was exuberant. He said, "We got it." He's showing me on his phone, "We got it." He's showing me that headline from the Sydney Morning Herald. "We got the $1 million fines for bankers." I'm going, "Congratulations, mate. Good on you." Right. This is excellent work, etc. And then the very next day, if you can go to that next headline again, the very next day, this was the headline: $1 million fines dumped after bankers raised legitimate concerns. And what happened? The CEOs of the major banks and Anna Bligh called Jim Chalmers and said, "You're not going to do this." And actually one of their reasons that they pitched to Jim Chalmers was, if bank executives have to pay $1 million fines to be held accountable for misconduct, we won't be able to attract the talent we need to run the banks. I mean, their excuse was effectively an admission that they're all a pack of crooks and they attract crooks to run banks. And this was a high bar of accountability, by the way. This was not someone who is a bank executive and doesn't know what's going on their watch. There was a high bar of accountability. This is people who, like in the Westpac case, had been repeatedly warned by the relevant people that they had a problem and they ignored it. Those are the guys that should have got fined in the Westpac case, right? That's what it applied to, not people who didn't know, you couldn't prove they knew anything underneath them. It was a very high bar, but that wasn't good enough for the banks. And they pull rank on the government. And this is what I want people to understand. The banks pulled rank on the government because they have more power than the government. And they've got power over the political parties through their donations. They've got power over the economy because they control the credit of the Australian economy. And in early 2019, just after the Hayne report was handed down, and the intention of the government, and the government said, "Yeah, we're going to implement these recommendations." And the first big one was responsible lending laws. The banks went on a credit strike in Australia. And suddenly it was really hard to get credit because the banks held the economy to ransom because they didn't want those laws. And they had that power, Martin, because there's no alternative to them. The government doesn't have its own institution anymore that can provide the credit Australia needs, right? And we're at the end of the show. This is the answer to your question. Are the banksters calling the shots? Yes. And that's one of the egregious, that's one. There's lots of others. That's one of the egregious examples of it. And I probably covered this on the last show, but the other one is Anna Bligh has left the Banking Association now. Who has replaced her? A senior Liberal politician, Simon Birmingham, the former finance minister in the Morrison government. The guy, by the way, who is responsible for Christine Holgate not getting her job back at Australia Post. Because as finance minister, she was knifed by the banks because she wanted a postal bank. They created this scandal around the watches 2 years after the watches were purchased. he, as finance minister and a shareholder minister in Australia Post, had appointed the internal departmental investigation, which cleared her name. It was done by Maddox lawyers, and it cleared her name. As the shareholder minister of Australia Post, he should have restored her to her job. Instead, he replaced her with the current CEO of Australia Post, Paul Graham, the day before the first Senate hearing into her case. The Senate hearing cleared her reputation. But from a practical standpoint, it was this early inquiry that cleared her name. And he made sure she didn't get her job back. Ever since then, the banks have run roughshod over Australia Post again, just like they were before Christine Holgate got there. And Simon Birmingham has left Parliament early, and he's ended up as the CEO of the Australian Banking Association on a salary, by the way, which the banks do not disclose. And I have a good idea why they wouldn't disclose it. Because when a politician moves from a $200,000 or $300,000 a year salary into what, 2 million, 3 million, whatever they might get from the Banking Association, it's a damn good payoff. And David Pocock did some figures the other day, how since 1990, every mining minister in Australia, in the federal government, every single mining minister since 1990 has left Parliament to go work for mining companies. That's the revolving door to mining companies. We have a revolving door to the banks. We have revolving doors to all these. We have a revolving door to the defence sector, to the weapons manufacturers now. That's a big thing they're making money out of. Christopher Pyne and Scott Morrison and Arthur Sinodinos and Joe Hockey, they're all cashing in on weapons. This is how corruption happens in Australia. The payoff is after the event, right, when they leave office. And in Birmingham's case, this politician has now joined the Banking Association. And yeah, that's why, and I come back to it, there's one thing that'll take down the power of the banks more effectively than anything else. And that is bring back a government bank, because it's the competition. It's a bank that can be the tool of government policy to make sure that credit is provided to the economy, regardless of what the private banks do, right? And it's a bank that can set standards in the economy again. That's the solution.
Yep. And that's the point, isn't there? There is actually an alternative path which could be very beneficial. And, the original conception of the Commonwealth Bank years and years and years back was to actually allow the economic prosperity of Australia to develop. And they were plugged into the industrial development of the country and also housing as well as part of that. And for a long period of time, it was very successful. So there's an earlier show, I'll put a link below, where we went into that in some detail. And as we come into the show, I'll just make one other little comment. Did you notice that Anna Blythe on the way out diluted some of the terms under the banking code as well? So just as a passing shot, I noticed.
Yeah, she took out the words, I was going to say fair and balanced. Is it fairness and integrity or something?
It was basically, it diluted the capacity of what the bank needed to do. They
would have said, they're motherhood statements. We don't need them.
Exactly, exactly right. But the point as we come to the end of the show is, yes, the banks hold a lot of the cards, pull a lot of the strings. The politicians are relatively weak in their response because they fear the banks. And I would also add into that category, not just the banks, but you could talk about big oil and big energy and all the other big players. They've all got fingers in the game. They're all basically tilting the scales away from ordinary Australians. And so the result of this is we have a relatively corrupt structure within the country, and it can't be fixed from just marginal changes around the edge. There's got to be a fundamental structural change. And so one of those core ideas is to create a public bank, a bank that effectively can do the things that banking should be doing rather than the things they are doing.
Yeah, and pay attention to Tassie people, because the Jeremy Rockcliffe got back into power, the Liberals are back in power there. And I was glad they did, because they came up with something very interesting for the election. They campaigned on starting a public insurance company, bringing back a government insurance office. We had them for, whatever it was, 80, 90 years in Australia. And like with the neoliberal wave, they got rid of those. And we should talk about insurance more than we do. But we want a public bank and a public insurance company, and they've promised it, and now they've got to deliver on it, right? But I've been talking to them, and I think they're serious. They're going to have a huge bun fight. A week or so ago, Suncorp announced its profit. It's Suncorp Insurance announced its profit. They had a 50% increase in profit to well over $1 billion. And the Suncorp CEO was on Sky News, and he whinged. He said, people are talking about government being in insurance. I don't think government should be in insurance. He said, what government should do is share the risk of insurance with the private companies. I mean, he said the ticker below him was announcing a 50% increase in profit. And this guy had the temerity to say, oh, no, we don't want government insurance. We want government to make us even more profitable. They let them carry the risk for us. Right?
Socialize the losses, privatize the profits.
Privatize the profits. They are that arrogant. These are arrogant bastards. We've got to break the mentality. We've got to bring them to heel. We have to smash the power of these. We don't have to smash the corporations. We've got to smash their power. They'll always be profitable. Don't become a bleeding heart, human rights for corporations. They will always be profitable. They've got too much power, and we've got to smash it. And that in the banking, that means a public bank.
And there has to be a debate about how much profit is too much profit, right? So there has to be a balance. And if you look at it at the moment, it's completely unbalanced. And just as we close, I just want to highlight, because Socrates actually made a really interesting point. I've been on about this. This is about the upcoming census, right? In the census in 2021, 122,000 people were estimated to be experiencing homelessness, right? Now, the question is, will they, in the coming census, pass information to gain information from those living in tents cities? Will they be actually, So the point is, the census tends to actually just be addresses.
That's true.
So there's a really critical issue here that we need to actually start asking the ABS. How are they going to make sure that they capture the full data on those who are homeless? Because I don't believe 122,000 people were homeless in 2021. I think it's a much bigger number than that. And the number's a lot higher now. So just a little sidebar issue, which I'm campaigning on at the moment. I want the ABS to tell us how they're going to actually survey the tent cities.
Well, because you're not a see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil politician, Mark. What problem, right? That's and it comes down to that. I mean, if I was anywhere near government, I would be thinking, man, all my fantasies have come true. What can I fix?
Yeah.
Right? Actually fix it. During the election, I met a Labor Party staffer he'd just become an ex-Labor Party staffer in a minister's office. And he said to me, what he didn't like about the Labor Party is his job in that minister's office was to come up with announceables in response to problems, not solutions, announceables. So there was a burning political problem that they had to respond to. What can they say to look like they're responding to it without actually having to fix it?
Yep.
And that was his day job in a Labor minister's office. And I'm saying Labor because that's where he was, but don't kid yourself. The others are no better. This is just these people are more interested in their internal political fighting. What all the Liberals in Parliament are thinking about right now? How long Susan Lay's going to last and who's going to replace her?
Yep.
Right? And the media is getting in on that. They love it, right? They love it. Actually saying, holding the government to account. Hey, have you fixed this problem? Actually saying, what are you talking about 5% deposits? What are you going to solve with that? Right? You're just luring these kids into debt, mate. Where's the actual accountability? But there is none. So, and look, my last comment is we have these solutions, but for the Australian people, the key is to keep voting against the major parties, right? Get behind parties that have actual solutions, vote against the major parties. And at a certain point, we'll reach I think we're close to critical mass. We'll actually reach critical mass. I think the Liberal Party is a party that can go extinct in Australia because it's just a disaster. Labor has Labor will go extinct last because it's got a bit of a stranglehold at the moment, but that's somewhat superficial. But we need to sweep it out and replace it with serious representatives who want to fix problems.
Absolutely, Robbie. And if people want to find out more about you, where's the best place to go?
Citizensparty.org.au. You behind me is our old logo. Some who regular followers might notice we've got a new logo now. We're sort of revamping a lot to do with the Citizens Party at the moment. We're on a membership drive. We have just set up an office in Penrith in Sydney, where we have volunteers working out of that, manning the phones for our membership drive. We have a goal to get registered in New South Wales in time to contest the next state election, which means we have to get registered by November. We have a goal to get to 10,000 members in Australia and then go beyond that. So if you're supportive of the party, you can join the party, become a member for $30. It's all available there on the website. And we do regular updates on our YouTube channel, the Citizens Report on YouTube once a week. And otherwise, you can follow me on Twitter at Robbie Barwick, TikTok. TikTok's my new favorite one. Facebook, Instagram, apparently. I post to Instagram too. LinkedIn. Try and be across all of it.
Excellent, Robbie. Well, thank you very much for your time tonight. Really appreciate it. And I think you've made some really, really important points for people to understand. You know, the point is there are alternatives, but only by actually shaking things up a bit can we actually have the alternatives come to life. But if we don't, then effectively we're going to get more of the same old, and it's going to be harder and harder for ordinary Australians and ordinary businesses to thrive and survive. And that is not the way it should be. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Links and things are below. Thanks, if people want to follow on. And I'll look forward to getting you back on the show later in the year as well, Robbie. Keep the fight going.
Absolutely. So don't go too far away from where you are. Stay close.
Exactly. Robbie, I'll take you offline and I'll close the show. Cheers.
All right. Thanks, man.
So there you go. Hope you found that interesting, informative, and hopefully a little entertaining. Thank you very much for all the chats. And thank you very much, Super the Chat, particularly, of course, from our very favourite supporter. Thank you. I really must say that, Jason, you are a star. Thank you so much for continuing to support us. Well, next week, just to say that it's going to be the monthly review of the markets with Damien Klassen. So join us for that. In terms of doggies, I have doggies here, sort of. They're a little bit sort of all over the place. So I'll just zoom out slightly for you so you can see them. They look like they had a big day, but they haven't really. They've just been sleeping. So thank you very much for that. And please like and subscribe. Check out our other recorded shows. Check out the interests of the people as well. You saw that John was there on the IOTP handle there. We put a big show up yesterday relating to corruption. We're going to be doing more shows on IOTP, so check that out. And check out the other recorded shows on the DFA channel. And we're back next Tuesday for another live show. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics signing off. We'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.